You're a burden, Margaret. Daniel is gone, and I'm not spending the rest of my life taking care of you. My daughter-in-law said those words to me 3 days after we buried my son, and she said them while standing in the middle of the living room Daniel had paid for, the same living room where he used to sit every Sunday afternoon with a cup of black coffee and ask me about my week. I didn't answer her right away. I was sitting in my usual armchair, the one near the window that looks out over the maple tree in the front yard, my hands folded neatly over the soft gray cardigan I've worn for years. The house still smelled faintly of the lilies from the funeral, sweet and heavy, clinging to the air like grief itself. Lily stood across from me, her black hair falling straight to her shoulders, her posture rigid, her expression cold in a way that almost surprised me. For years she had been polite, careful, measured. But grief has a way of stripping people down to who they really are. This house is too big for you, she continued, her voice calm but firm. You can't manage the stairs. You can't handle the upkeep. It's time to think about a senior community. I looked past her, at the hallway that led to Daniel's office. The door was closed. It had been closed since the night the hospital called. 80 years is a long time to live, long enough to know that silence can be more powerful than argument. So I remained silent. My back ached the way it always does after sitting too long, and when I finally rose from the chair, I did it slowly, pressing one hand against the armrest for balance. I am not as strong as I used to be. My shoulders curve forward now. My steps are careful, but I am not weak. Lily mistook my quiet for surrender. I've already started looking at places, she said, as if she were discussing a new sofa or a paint color. They have activities, medical staff, everything you'd need. Everything I'd need. I thought about what I needed. I needed my son. I needed the sound of his truck pulling into the driveway. I needed the way he used to call out, "Mom, you home?" Even though he knew I always was. Instead, I had polished hardwood floors that echoed when people walked across them and a dining table set for two that would never again seat my child. Daniel wouldn't want you alone here, she added, and that was the only moment my chest tightened. Because she was wrong. Daniel had known me better than anyone. He knew I still baked my own bread every Thursday. He knew I balanced my checkbook down to the last dollar. He knew I walked a mile around the neighborhood every morning, even in the cold Massachusetts wind, leaning slightly forward but steady on my feet. He knew I was capable. I studied Lily's face then, searching for some trace of sadness that matched my own, but all I saw was calculation. Not cruelty exactly, just impatience. A desire to move forward, to reorganize the pieces of her life now that my son was no longer standing in the center of it. I'll think about it, I said finally, my voice even. She seemed relieved, as though I had just agreed to something far more final. That evening, after she went upstairs to Daniel's bedroom, I remained in the kitchen long after the sun had set. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked above the stove. I ran my fingers along the edge of the counter Daniel had installed himself 10 years ago, measuring twice before cutting, determined to make it perfect. 3 months before he passed, he had taken me to lunch at a small seafood place by the harbor. He'd been quiet that day too, thoughtful. "Mom," he had said, stirring his iced tea, "I've arranged things. Just in case. I want you protected." I hadn't asked what he meant. I trusted him. Now, standing alone in the dim kitchen light, I realized that trust might be the only thing keeping me steady. The next morning, while Lily was still asleep, I picked up the phone and called Daniel's attorney. The morning after I called Daniel's attorney, the house felt even quieter than before, as if the walls themselves were listening. I woke up at 5:30, the way I always do, long before the sun rises over our street in Wellesley, and I sat on the edge of my bed for a moment to steady my back before standing. The hallway carpet was soft under my feet as I made my way toward the kitchen, passing Daniel's closed office door without touching the handle. I could hear nothing from upstairs, which meant Lily was still asleep in the bedroom she once shared with my son. I brewed a pot of coffee, measuring the grounds carefully, the way Daniel liked it, though I knew I was the only one who would drink it. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and familiar, but it did not erase the heaviness in my chest. I sat at the small round table near the window instead of the larger dining table, and I watched the sky slowly turn from charcoal gray to pale blue. This house has 4 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, and more memories than I can count. Daniel bought it 25 years ago, but I helped choose the curtains, the light fixtures, the maple cabinets. I planted the hydrangeas along the front walkway myself, kneeling in the dirt with gloves that were 2 sizes too big. After he married Lily, I moved into the first-floor guest room so they could have the master upstairs. It seemed like the natural thing to do. Mothers adjust. Mothers make room. That was always my philosophy. Around 7, I heard footsteps overhead and the soft creak of the staircase. Lily entered the kitchen already dressed, her hair smooth, her expression composed. She did not look at me right away. Instead, she opened the refrigerator and scanned its contents as though she were assessing inventory. "We need to talk about finances," she said finally, pouring herself a glass of orange juice. "Daniel handled everything, and I need to understand what bills are coming in." I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug, letting the warmth settle into my fingers. For years, Daniel and I had reviewed statements together at this very table. Mortgage paid off. Property taxes scheduled twice a year. Utilities on automatic withdrawal. I knew the numbers as well as I knew my own birthday. "I have copies of the accounts," I said calmly. "Your name was added to some of them after the wedding." She nodded but did not thank me. Instead, she placed her phone on the counter and began typing, her brow slightly furrowed. "The house might sell for over $1.2 million in this market," she said, almost to herself. "It would be easier for everyone if we did. Not drag this out." Drag what out? I did not ask the question aloud, but it echoed in my mind. I realized then that in her version of the future, I was not included. I was a complication to be managed, a loose end to be tied. Later that afternoon, while she was upstairs making phone calls in a low voice, I walked slowly through each room on the first floor. I ran my hand along the banister Daniel had sanded himself. I paused at the mantel where his high school graduation photo still stood in a silver frame. He was 17 in that picture, tall, hopeful, with that same steady gaze he carried into adulthood. 3 months before he passed, he had insisted on driving me to my doctor appointment, even though it was only 10 miles away. "I promised Dad I would always look after you," he had said, referring to my late husband who passed 15 years ago. That promise had not sounded temporary. By evening, Lily had changed the passcode on the security system. She said it was for safety. She did not offer me the new number until I asked. When I climbed into bed that night, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the unfamiliar silence. It was not grief alone that kept me awake. It was the slow, steady realization that I was being edged out of my own life, inch by inch, in a house where I had once felt indispensable. The following morning, I moved more carefully than usual, not because my back hurt more than it had the day before, but because I had begun to understand that every movement of mine was being measured. Lily had started keeping her laptop open on the kitchen counter, its screen angled slightly away from me, and whenever I entered the room, she would minimize whatever document she had been reviewing. I did not ask what she was working on. Instead, I buttered my toast slowly and carried my plate to the small round table by the window. Outside, the maple tree was beginning to shed early autumn leaves, thin gold pieces drifting down onto the front lawn. I had once mowed myself before Daniel insisted on hiring a landscaping service. After breakfast, I heard her voice in the hallway, low but urgent. She was speaking to someone on the phone. I could not hear every word, but certain phrases reached me clearly. "Yes, as soon as possible." "No, she does not have anywhere else to go. It would be cleaner if it is done quickly." "Cleaner." The word lingered in the air long after she ended the call. I folded the dish towel neatly over the sink handle and pretended I had not heard anything. For 80 years I have learned that reacting too soon gives away power. Later that afternoon, a man in a navy blazer pulled into the driveway. He carried a leather folder under his arm and looked around the property with the practiced eye of someone assessing value. Lily met him on the front steps, smiling in a way I had not seen since before the funeral. I remained inside, standing just behind the living room curtains, watching them gesture toward the roofline, the windows, the width of the lot. 12,000 square feet of land, Daniel had once told me proudly. Plenty of space for grandchildren one day. I stepped back before they could see me and returned to my armchair. My hands were steady, but my thoughts were not. Selling the house had not been a suggestion. It had been a plan already in motion. When the man finally left, Lily walked inside with brisk steps and went straight upstairs without acknowledging me. A few minutes later, I heard drawers opening and closing in Daniel's office. That was the first time I felt something sharper than grief. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to awakening. That evening, While Lily showered, I made my way down the hallway and paused at the office door. It was slightly ajar. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. Daniel's desk was organized the way he always kept it, files stacked precisely. A framed photo of us at Cape Cod 5 summers ago placed in the corner. But one drawer was missing its lock. I could see the scratch marks where someone had tried to force it open. I did not touch anything. I simply observed. On the desk sat a thin folder labeled estate planning in Daniel's careful handwriting. It was empty. I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering the seafood lunch by the harbor 3 months earlier, the way he had looked at me across the table with quiet certainty. "Mom, I have taken care of it," he had said. I had believed him then, and I believed him now. I returned to my bedroom without making a sound. That night, as I lay beneath the quilt I stitched 20 years ago, I replayed every detail of the day in my mind. The real estate agent, the phone calls, the missing documents. Lily was moving quickly, as if speed could secure her future. What she did not know was that I had already taken a step of my own. My appointment with Daniel's attorney was scheduled for Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. I did not intend to mention it. Sometimes the quietest person in the room knows the most. Thursday morning arrived with a thin layer of frost on the front lawn, delicate and temporary, the kind that disappears as soon as the sun finds it. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy skirt that fell below my knees and the cream cardigan Daniel once said made me look dignified. My silver hair was brushed neatly away from my face, and I applied a small touch of lipstick, the soft rose shade I have worn for years. When I stepped into the kitchen, Lily was already there, scrolling through her phone with a cup of tea untouched beside her. She glanced at me briefly. "You are up early," she said. I nodded. "I have an appointment in Boston," I replied, keeping my tone steady. She did not ask where or with whom. Perhaps she assumed it was a doctor visit or a church errand. Perhaps she did not think it mattered. I took my purse from the hook by the pantry door and paused for a moment, looking around the kitchen. The granite counters reflected the morning light. The refrigerator hummed softly. For a house that large, it could feel surprisingly small when tension filled it. I drove myself the 22 miles into the city, hands firm on the steering wheel, eyes focused on the familiar highway signs. The traffic moved steadily, and I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. Grief had been a fog these past days, but beneath it there was something else now. Clarity. Daniel's attorney's office was on the 5th floor of a brick building overlooking a narrow street lined with coffee shops and small boutiques. I took the elevator slowly, aware of the slight tremor in my fingers, but unwilling to let it show. Mr. Jonathan Reed greeted me with a firm handshake and guided me into his office, where shelves of leather-bound books lined the walls. He spoke gently, expressing his condolences once more, then opened a thick folder with my son's name printed across the tab. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, adjusting his glasses. Daniel was very thorough. I folded my hands in my lap and listened. He explained that 3 months before his passing, Daniel had updated his estate plan. A revocable living trust had been established. The house, the investment accounts, and a controlling interest in his company shares were all placed under that trust. My name, Margaret Whitmore, was listed clearly as primary beneficiary of the residence and designated trustee in the event of his death. I did not interrupt him, though my heart began to beat faster. "There are also specific provisions," Mr. Reed continued, sliding a document toward me. "Your son included language to ensure that you could reside in the home for the remainder of your life without interference." Without interference. The words felt solid, like the foundation beneath my feet. He went on to explain that any attempt to pressure or remove me from the property would trigger a forfeiture clause affecting other distributions. Daniel had anticipated conflict. Daniel had prepared for it. As Mr. Reed spoke, I saw my son not as the boy in the graduation photo or the man in the hospital bed, but as the steady adult who had sat across from me at the harbor restaurant and promised I would be protected. He had not spoken casually that day. He had acted. When the meeting ended, I held copies of the documents in a slim folder of my own. I thanked Mr. Reed and stepped back out into the crisp morning air. The city noise seemed distant, unimportant. I drove home at a measured pace, watching the late autumn trees blur past in shades of gold and rust. By the time I turned into our driveway, the frost had melted completely, leaving the grass damp and shining. Lily's car was parked where it always was, angled slightly toward the garage. I sat in my own car for a moment before stepping out, the folder resting quietly in my purse. The house looked the same as it had every other day of my life for the past quarter century. Only now, I understood something that Lily did not. I was not standing on borrowed time. I was standing on ground my son had already secured. I did not tell Lily about the meeting in Boston when I walked back into the house that afternoon. She was seated at the kitchen counter with a stack of papers spread neatly in front of her, a yellow legal pad filled with figures written in tight, controlled handwriting. She looked up briefly as I set my purse down on the chair. "How was your appointment?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. "Productive," I replied, removing my gloves finger by finger and placing them carefully on the table. That single word seemed to satisfy her. She returned to her calculations without another question. I could see columns of numbers, estimated sale price, closing costs, projected profits. She had already begun dividing a future that did not yet belong to her. I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the sink, watching the reflection of both of us in the dark window above it. We looked like two women sharing a home. In truth, we were standing on opposite sides of an invisible line. Over the next few days, small changes began to appear. A real estate brochure lay on the coffee table. A folder labeled Market Analysis rested beside Daniel's old laptop. Lily spent longer hours on the phone, her voice soft but urgent, speaking about timing and strategy and moving forward. Each time she passed me in the hallway, she offered a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. I responded with calm nods and quiet routines. I watered the houseplants. I folded laundry. I baked a loaf of bread on Thursday morning, just as I always had, the smell filling the kitchen with warmth that felt almost defiant. On Friday evening, she finally sat across from me at the dining table, her hands folded as if preparing for a business meeting. "I have scheduled an estate review with Daniel's attorney next week," she said. "It is time to settle everything formally." I looked at her steadily. "That sounds appropriate," I answered. She seemed reassured by my composure, mistaking it again for compliance. "It will be easier if we present a united front," she added. United. The word lingered between us. I wondered what unity meant to her. Did it mean silence? Agreement? Removal? I did not challenge her. Instead, I asked what day and what time. "Tuesday at 11 in the morning," she replied. I nodded once. "I will be ready." That night, I sat alone in the living room with the lamp casting a soft circle of light over Daniel's favorite chair. I opened my purse and removed the copy of the trust documents Mr. Reed had given me. The paper felt firm and official beneath my fingertips. My name was printed clearly in black ink. Primary beneficiary. Trustee. Lifetime residence guaranteed. There was also the clause Mr. Reed had emphasized, the one written in precise legal language stating that any attempt to pressure or remove me from the property would result in a forfeiture of certain benefits by the challenging party. Daniel had not written those words in anger. He had written them in protection. I placed the documents back into the folder and returned them to my purse. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vengeful. What I felt was steady. For the first time since the funeral, the ground beneath my feet seemed solid again. Upstairs, I could hear Lily moving through the master bedroom, opening and closing drawers, perhaps already deciding what to pack first. She believed the future was hers to organize. She believed time was on her side. What she did not know was that Tuesday morning would not unfold the way she expected. I turned off the lamp and let the room fall into darkness, my back straight despite its age, my breathing slow and even. Silence, I have learned, can carry more weight than any raised voice. Tuesday arrived with a thin gray sky stretching over Wellesley, the kind of sky that feels undecided, neither stormy nor clear. Lily dressed in a tailored black blazer and low heels, her movements efficient and deliberate. I chose a soft gray suit I had worn to Daniel's college graduation many years ago, pressing the fabric carefully the night before. When we left the house together, she walked slightly ahead of me toward the car, keys in hand, as if she were leading a meeting rather than attending one. The drive into Boston was quiet. Traffic moved steadily along the highway, and the city skyline appeared slowly in the distance, sharp against the muted clouds. Lily scrolled through emails on her phone while I watched the road. I kept my purse resting firmly on my lap, the folder inside it lying flat and undisturbed. We arrived at the brick building a few minutes before 11. Inside the elevator, Lily adjusted her hair and straightened her shoulders. "It is better to resolve everything quickly," she said without looking at me. "Dragging things out only creates confusion." I nodded once. "Clarity is important," I replied. Mr. Jonathan Reed greeted us with the same composed expression he had worn the previous week. If he felt any surprise at seeing Lily beside me, he did not show it. We were guided into the conference room, a long polished table centered beneath soft overhead lighting. Lily sat upright, hands folded, projecting calm authority. I placed my purse beside my chair and rested my palms gently on the table. Mr. Reed began by reviewing Daniel's estate plan in a measured tone. He explained the creation of the revocable living trust, the allocation of assets, and the structure Daniel had carefully outlined. Lily listened intently, occasionally nodding as though confirming information she already assumed. When Mr. Reed mentioned the residence, she leaned forward slightly. "The property will need to be evaluated for sale," she interjected. "We want to move forward efficiently." Mr. Reed paused and glanced at his documents. "The residence," he said carefully, "is held within the trust with specific provisions regarding occupancy." Lily's brow tightened. "What does that mean exactly?" Mr. Reed adjusted his glasses and continued. "Daniel designated Mrs. Margaret Whitmore as primary beneficiary of the home and trustee of the residential portion of the trust. She has the legal right to reside in the property for the duration of her lifetime." The room grew very still. Lily blinked once, then again, as if recalculating something in her mind. "I am his wife," she said evenly. "Surely that does not exclude me." "You are a beneficiary of other assets," Mr. Reed replied, his voice calm and professional. "However, the trust includes a protective clause. Any attempt to coerce or remove Mrs. Whitmore from the residence would result in forfeiture of certain distributions allocated to the challenging party." The word forfeiture seemed to hang in the air. Lily's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Her hands, which had been neatly folded, now pressed flat against the table. I did not look at her immediately. Instead, I focused on the grain of the polished wood beneath my fingertips. Daniel had anticipated this exact moment. He had written language not in anger, but in foresight. After a long pause, Lily asked, "So the house cannot be sold without her consent?" "That is correct," Mr. Reed answered. Silence followed, heavier than before. I finally turned my head and met Lily's eyes. I did not smile. I did not speak. I simply held her gaze, steady and unhurried. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, she looked uncertain. The meeting continued with details about accounts and timelines, but the balance in the room had already shifted. When we stood to leave, Lily gathered her papers more slowly than she had arrived. Outside, the air felt cooler than before. As we walked toward the car, she remained quiet. I moved at my usual pace, neither hurried nor hesitant. The ground beneath my feet felt firm, and for the first time in weeks, I understood that I was not being edged out. I was exactly where my son intended me to be. The drive home from Boston felt longer than the drive into the city, even though the distance was the same 22 miles. Lily kept both hands on the steering wheel, her posture stiff, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She did not turn on the radio. She did not check her phone. The silence between us was no longer casual. It was deliberate. I watched the familiar highway signs pass by and rested my purse against my hip, feeling the steady outline of the folder inside it. When we pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as it always had, pale gray siding, white trim, the maple tree scattering leaves across the lawn. Yet something invisible had shifted. Lily stepped out of the car quickly and walked toward the front door without waiting for me. I followed at my usual pace, my shoes pressing firmly against the stone walkway Daniel had installed himself one summer afternoon. Inside, she placed her bag on the kitchen counter and finally spoke. "You knew," she said, her voice controlled but thinner than before. I removed my coat slowly and hung it on the hook by the pantry. "Daniel and I discussed many things," I replied. It was not a direct answer, and she understood that. She exhaled sharply and crossed her arms. It would have been helpful to be informed. I met her gaze calmly. "The documents were finalized by your husband," I said. If there were questions, he would have addressed them. The room fell quiet again. The refrigerator hummed. The clock above the stove ticked steadily, marking seconds that felt heavier than usual. For the rest of the afternoon, Lily moved through the house in short, precise motions. She gathered the real estate brochures from the coffee table and slid them into a drawer. She closed her laptop with more force than necessary. I returned to my routines. I watered the plants along the windowsill, trimming a yellowing leaf from the fern Daniel gave me on my 75th birthday. I wiped down the kitchen counters and set a pot of soup to simmer on the stove. The scent of chicken and thyme filled the air, warm and steady. That evening, she did not join me at the dining table. Instead, she carried a bowl upstairs and closed the bedroom door behind her. I ate alone, listening to the soft clink of my spoon against the ceramic bowl. After dinner, I walked slowly through the living room and paused by the fireplace. The framed photograph of Daniel at Cape Cod caught the light from the lamp beside it. In the picture, he stood with his arm around my shoulders, the ocean stretching wide behind us, the wind pushing his hair back from his forehead. He had always stood slightly in front of me, protective without being possessive. I reached out and straightened the frame, though it was not crooked. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, there was a knock on my door. Lily stood in the hallway, her expression composed once more, though something restless flickered behind her eyes. "We will need to discuss how expenses are handled going forward," she said. "If the house cannot be sold, we still have to be practical." I nodded. "Of course," I answered. "We will follow the structure Daniel put in place." She hesitated, as if expecting more resistance, then simply said good night. When the house grew quiet again, I sat on the edge of my bed and reflected on the change I had witnessed. Power does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it shifts in silence, in legal language written months before anyone realizes its importance. Lily had believed she was managing a transition. She had believed I was a temporary inconvenience. Now she understood that I was not leaving. I turned off the bedside lamp and lay back against my pillow, my back slightly curved, my breathing slow and even. The house did not feel smaller anymore. It felt anchored, and for the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself a single, steady breath of relief. The next morning the house felt different again, not tense in the sharp way it had the week before, but heavy, like the air before a long winter. Lily left early without saying much, her footsteps brisk across the hardwood floor, the front door closing with careful restraint rather than force. I stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee in my hands and watched her car disappear down the quiet suburban street. The maple tree in the yard was nearly bare now, its branches thin and exposed against a pale sky. Change, I have learned, is never sudden. It arrives in layers. Over the next few days, Lily adjusted her approach. She no longer mentioned selling the house outright. Instead, she began speaking about renovations, upgrades, improvements that would increase value someday. "We could update the kitchen," she said one afternoon, running her hand across the granite counter. "New cabinets, modern lighting. It would make the space more efficient." I listened carefully. "Daniel chose these cabinets," I replied softly. "He liked the wood grain." She gave a small nod, as if indulging nostalgia, but her eyes moved quickly across the room, measuring, calculating. Later that evening, she brought a stack of utility bills to the table. "Expenses will need to be divided clearly," she said. "If you are remaining in the house, we should establish boundaries." Boundaries. The word was deliberate. I unfolded my reading glasses and examined the statements one by one. Electric, water, property tax installment due in December. I knew these numbers before she ever placed them in front of me. "The trust outlines responsibility for maintenance and property expenses," I said evenly. "We will follow that structure." She hesitated. "You seem very certain." I met her gaze without raising my voice. Daniel was very organized. That night, I walked slowly through the hallway toward his office. The door was open now, the space no longer guarded. Papers had been stacked neatly on the desk, but the sense of intrusion lingered. I stepped inside and lowered myself into the leather chair behind his desk. It was larger than the one in my bedroom, firm and steady. From that angle, I could see the entire room differently: the bookshelves, the framed certificates, the small brass lamp he had purchased at an antique store years ago. I rested my hands on the desk and allowed myself to remember the sound of his voice filling this space during conference calls, confident and calm. He had built a life of order. He had prepared for uncertainty. Downstairs, I could hear Lily moving through the kitchen, opening cabinets, closing drawers. The rhythm of the house had shifted, but it had not broken. The following afternoon she approached me again, her expression measured. I may consider relocating eventually, she said carefully. Closer to my office. It might be practical. I nodded once. You should do what is best for you. There was a brief pause, and for the first time since the meeting in Boston, her composure wavered. I did not expect this, she admitted quietly. I assumed things would be different. I studied her face, noticing not hostility now, but frustration at plans undone. Daniel thought ahead, I said. He wanted stability. She looked away, toward the staircase leading upstairs, and did not respond. That evening, as I folded a blanket in the living room and turned off the lamps one by one, I realized something important. The struggle was no longer about removing me. It was about adjusting to a reality neither of us could change. I moved through the darkened house at my usual pace, my back slightly curved, but my steps steady. The walls did not feel as though they were closing in anymore. They felt firm, settled, rooted. And in that quiet, I understood that sometimes the greatest shift is not loud or dramatic. It is the quiet acceptance that the foundation beneath you is never as fragile as someone else believed. By the second week after the meeting in Boston, the rhythm of the house had settled into something quieter, almost cautious. Lily no longer spoke about renovations or market value. Instead, she spent long hours in the upstairs bedroom with the door half closed, her voice low during conference calls, her footsteps softer across the hallway. I continued my routines with deliberate steadiness. Every morning at 6 o'clock, I walked my usual mile around the neighborhood, the cold Massachusetts air sharp in my lungs, the sidewalks lined with fallen leaves that crunched beneath my sneakers. Neighbors offered gentle condolences as I passed, their voices kind but brief. I thanked them and kept moving. Movement has always helped me think. When I returned home one afternoon, I noticed 3 medium-sized cardboard boxes stacked neatly by the staircase. They were sealed with clear packing tape and labeled in black marker. Bedroom, office, personal. I paused only for a moment before continuing into the kitchen. Lily stood at the counter, her expression composed but distant. I have accepted a temporary housing arrangement closer to my office, she said without preamble. It makes sense while everything stabilizes. I set my keys down carefully. That sounds practical, I replied. She studied me as if expecting resistance, but there was none. I will need a few weeks to finalize details, she added. I nodded once. Take the time you need. The conversation ended there, not with anger, not with apology, but with a quiet acknowledgement that the future had shifted course. That evening, as she carried one of the boxes down the stairs, she stopped midway and looked toward the living room where I was folding laundry. I did not intend for things to become complicated, she said, her voice less sharp than before. I smoothed a towel across my lap. Life rarely asks about intention, I answered gently. She held my gaze for a moment, then continued down the stairs. Over the next several days, the house slowly began to feel larger again. Closet space cleared. Bathroom counters emptied. The master bedroom door remained open more often, sunlight stretching across the hardwood floor without obstruction. I did not interfere with her packing, nor did I offer assistance. There are moments when involvement complicates what silence can simplify. On her final evening in the house, she stood in the foyer with a single suitcase beside her and her car keys in hand. The cardboard boxes had already been loaded into her vehicle. The maple tree outside was completely bare now, its branches reaching into a pale winter sky. I will coordinate with the attorney regarding the remaining assets, she said formally. Of course, I replied. A brief pause lingered between us, filled not with hostility, but with the weight of everything unsaid. Daniel loved this house, she added quietly. I nodded. He built it carefully. She inhaled as if considering another sentence, then chose not to speak it. Instead, she opened the front door and stepped out into the cold evening air. I watched from the doorway as she walked down the stone path Daniel once laid by hand, her figure growing smaller with each step. When her car pulled away from the curb, the street returned to its familiar stillness. I closed the door gently and turned the lock. The house did not echo the way it had after the funeral. It felt settled. I walked slowly through each room, turning off lights, adjusting curtains, straightening a picture frame. In Daniel's office, I rested my hand on the back of his chair and allowed myself a single steady breath. I had been called a burden in this very house, yet I remained standing within it, not through argument or anger, but through patience and foresight. As I prepared for bed that night, the quiet no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. And for the first time since my son was laid to rest, I understood that stability is not given by those who doubt you. It is secured by those who believe in you long before the test arrives. Winter settled over Massachusetts in quiet layers after Lily left, the mornings colder, the sunlight thinner, the house finally breathing at its own pace again. I rose each day at 6 as I always had, wrapped my wool coat around my shoulders, and walked my mile through the neighborhood streets where Daniel once rode his bicycle as a boy. Frost traced delicate patterns along the sidewalks, and the air carried that sharp, clean scent that only comes in December. When I returned home, the silence no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like space. I began opening windows for a few minutes each afternoon, even in the cold, letting fresh air move through rooms that had held too much tension for too long. Daniel's office became my favorite place to sit. I did not rearrange anything. I did not remove his framed certificates or the brass lamp he loved. I simply added a small vase of white flowers to the corner of his desk and allowed the room to remain as he left it, steady and ordered. The attorney sent updated documents confirming the trust structure and outlining the next administrative steps. I read each page carefully at the kitchen table, adjusting my glasses as I reviewed the language that secured my right to remain. Property taxes would be paid through the trust. Maintenance expenses were clearly allocated. Investment accounts would provide sufficient income for my needs. Daniel had calculated everything down to the smallest detail. I felt no triumph in that realization, only gratitude. A few days before Christmas, Lily returned briefly to collect the last of her personal belongings. She knocked before entering, which told me more than any apology could have. Her movements were efficient but no longer hurried. The master bedroom emptied quietly, hangers sliding from the closet rod, drawers closing one final time. When she finished, she stood in the doorway of the living room and looked around as if memorizing the space. "I have signed a lease in Cambridge," she said. "It is closer to my office." I nodded. "I hope it brings you what you are looking for." She hesitated, then spoke more softly. I did not expect Daniel to structure things the way he did. I folded my hands in my lap. He believed in preparation. She gave a faint, almost reluctant smile. He always did. There was no bitterness in her voice now, only acceptance. When she left for the final time, she closed the front door gently behind her. I stood for a moment in the quiet foyer, listening to the fading sound of her car. Then I walked slowly through each room, turning on lamps as the early evening darkness settled outside. The house felt anchored, not because it was large or valuable, but because it was secure. I prepared a simple dinner and set a single place at the small round table by the window. The maple tree outside stood bare against the winter sky, its branches strong despite the season. After washing the dishes, I carried a blanket into the living room and sat in Daniel's favorite chair. The leather was cool beneath my hands, worn slightly at the edges from years of use. I did not feel like a burden. I did not feel displaced. I felt rooted. Daniel had ensured that I would not be moved by impatience or assumption. He had trusted me to stand steady, and I had done exactly that. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I realized that the house was no longer a place of conflict. It was simply home again, quiet and firm, built on foresight rather than fear, and I walked through it at my usual measured pace, knowing that the foundation beneath me was not temporary, but permanent. By early January, the house had settled into a rhythm that belonged entirely to me. The holiday decorations were simple that year, a small wreath on the front door and white lights along the banister Daniel had built with his own hands. I did not host a gathering. I did not feel the need to fill the rooms with noise. Instead, I honored the quiet. Each morning I prepared oatmeal on the stove, stirred slowly with a wooden spoon that has been in this kitchen for more than 30 years. I sat at the small round table and watched the winter light move across the floorboards. The trust documents were filed neatly in the drawer beside me, not as a weapon, but as reassurance. A few weeks after Lily relocated to Cambridge, I received a brief email from her. It was formal, almost businesslike, confirming that she had completed the necessary paperwork for the remaining accounts and thanking me for my cooperation. There was no bitterness in the message. There was no warmth either, just acceptance. I replied with equal simplicity, wishing her well in her new apartment and acknowledging the administrative details. I did not revisit the past. I did not mention the word she once used to describe me. That word had lost its power the moment the truth was read aloud in a conference room in Boston. One afternoon, I decided to reorganize the bookshelf in Daniel's office. I moved slowly, careful with each framed photo and certificate. At the back of one shelf, I found a small envelope addressed in Daniel's handwriting. It simply read, "For Mom." My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, though I felt no fear. Inside was a short note written in steady ink. He thanked me for teaching him discipline and patience. He wrote that strength does not always look loud, and that he had learned from watching me endure difficult seasons without losing dignity. At the bottom he had added, "I wanted to make sure you would always feel secure here." I folded the note carefully and pressed it against my chest for a moment before placing it back into the envelope. The house felt warmer after that, even though the temperature outside remained below freezing. In the evenings, I began lighting a small candle in the living room, letting its soft glow reflect against the window as snow gathered quietly along the street. Neighbors occasionally stopped by with casseroles or handwritten cards, and I welcomed them with calm gratitude. I was no longer defending my place. I was living in it. Some nights I would sit in Daniel's leather chair and imagine him walking through the front door again, calling out to me from the foyer. The ache of that absence never disappeared, but it no longer came with uncertainty. He had done what he could while he was here. I had done the rest. On a clear Sunday afternoon, I stood at the front window and looked at the maple tree in the yard. Its branches were bare, but strong, waiting for spring. I realized then that security is not measured in square footage or market value. It is measured in preparation, in foresight, in love expressed through action rather than words. I adjusted the collar of my cardigan and walked back into the kitchen to prepare dinner. The floors did not echo anymore. The walls did not feel temporary. This was my home, not because I demanded it, but because it had been entrusted to me with intention. And as I moved through each familiar room at my steady, deliberate pace, I understood something with complete clarity. I had never been a burden. I had always been the foundation. Spring arrived quietly in Wellesley, not with sudden warmth, but with small, patient signs. The maple tree outside my front window began to show the faintest hint of green at the tips of its branches, fragile buds pushing forward after months of cold. I stood at the sink one morning, rinsing a porcelain teacup, and noticed how different the light looked compared to the day Lily first called me a burden. Back then the house had felt uncertain, as if it were waiting for someone else to decide its future. Now it stood firm, sunlight moving confidently across the kitchen floor, touching the maple cabinets Daniel chose, the granite counters he installed, the small round tableware. I still begin every day. I have remained faithful to my routines. I walk my mile each morning, even when a light rain falls. I balance the accounts at the end of each month, reviewing the trust statements with careful attention. I prune the hydrangeas along the front walkway and kneel slowly, my back curved but steady, pressing fresh soil around their roots. Stability is not dramatic. It is quiet maintenance. One afternoon in early April, Lily sent another message. She wrote that her new apartment overlooks the Charles River and that she has grown accustomed to the city noise. She thanked me for handling the remaining property paperwork and said she hopes we can meet for coffee someday when time feels less complicated. I read the message twice before replying. I told her I wished her peace and success, and that coffee would be fine when she is ready. There was no resentment left in me. The conflict that once filled these rooms had dissolved into distance and understanding. That evening I carried a small wooden chair onto the front porch and sat facing the yard Daniel loved so much. The air smelled of damp earth and new grass. Children down the street rode their bicycles in slow circles, their laughter carrying lightly through the neighborhood. I folded my cardigan closer around my shoulders and closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the ordinary sounds of life continuing. I thought back to the day I sat in this same house and heard myself described as a burden. The word had cut deeply at the time, not because it was true, but because it questioned my place. Now I understand that place is not granted by approval. It is secured by intention, by foresight, by the quiet work done long before conflict appears. Daniel understood that. He did not argue. He prepared. And in doing so, he gave me something far greater than property. He gave me certainty. As the sun lowered behind the maple tree, casting long shadows across the lawn, I rose slowly from the porch chair and stepped back inside. I moved through each room with familiar ease, touching the back of Daniel's leather chair, straightening a framed photograph, turning on the lamp beside the fireplace. The house did not echo. It did not question my presence. It held me the way it always had, solid and unshaken. I was never an extra piece to be removed. I was part of the structure from the beginning. And as evening settled softly over the neighborhood, I understood with complete clarity that I am not living here because someone allowed it. I am living here because it was built, protected, and entrusted to me with love. The foundation remains strong. And so do I.